And now, here's our first story called Red Menace. On October 1st, 1950, Dr. Richard Wheat parked his car outside the Stanford University Hospital in San Francisco and walked towards the entrance. He lingered outside just for a moment and took a deep breath of the cool, foggy morning air. He readied himself and then headed inside. He weaved his way through the bustling, fluorescent hallways of the recovery ward. There were a few patients there he was eager to check on. He made his way to the room of one of the patients he'd been keeping an eye on for the past few weeks. It was a 75-year-old pipefitter named Edward Nevin Sr. Edward had been in and out of the hospital for months, but still nobody could quite figure out what was wrong with him. However, finally, a few weeks earlier, he'd had a surgery on his prostate, and it seemed to make him feel a whole lot better. He'd been recovering well in the hospital, and so now he was just a few days away from finally going back home to his family. But when Dr. Wheat opened the door to Edward's room, he was stunned by what he saw. The skinny old man laying under the sheets in bed turned to look at the doctor blankly. He didn't seem to recognize Dr. Wheat. Just a few days earlier, Edward had been lively and chatty. Now he looked pale and feeble. Dr. Wheat made his way over to Edward's bedside and asked him how he was doing. Edward groaned that he felt too weak to move. He developed a nasty cough, too. And more than that, it really hurt when he urinated, and his urine was also bright red. As Dr. Wheat listened, he nodded calmly and acted like everything was fine. But inside, he was very worried. A little blood in the urine was not out of the ordinary for a patient suffering from a urinary tract infection, or UTI. But it should not be so much that the urine was completely red. And it wasn't even clear if Edward had a UTI at all. So it seemed like something else must be wrong with Edward. Dr. Wheat knew he would need to do a thorough exam on Edward to really get a sense of what was going on here. Clearly, his condition was deteriorating. The doctor pulled out a stethoscope and placed the diaphragm on Edward's chest and then carefully listened to his breathing. And what he heard was just very rough breathing every time the man inhaled and exhaled, like there was a backup of mucus. To the doctor, it sounded like Edward had pneumonia, which is a lung infection. Having pneumonia, in addition to whatever this infection was inside of Edward's urinary tract, was dangerous for someone in Edward's condition, potentially even deadly. Dr. Wheat moved his stethoscope to listen to Edward's heart, and what he heard was his heartbeat sounded muffled, which was obviously not a good sign. This meant that maybe Edward's infection, this mystery infection, had moved through his bloodstream into his heart already, which meant there really wasn't much the doctors could do to help him. But Dr. Wheat didn't want to worry his patient even further, so even though he had some pretty grim news, he didn't share it. Instead, he just promised Edward they would do everything they could to get him back on his feet. After that, Dr. Wheat walked out of the room with a lot on his mind. Antibiotics could help Edward's infection, but he needed to figure out what was causing the infection to know what to prescribe. If they wanted to cure Edward, they were going to have to act fast. Later that night, a few floors down from where Dr. Wheat had checked on Edward Nevin, a lab technician named Ann Zuckerman processed blood samples in the Stanford Hospital lab. She had hoped to be home by this point, but Dr. Wheat had asked her to stay back and check a few more tests. Dr. Wheat had told her all about Edward Nevin's case, how the man had an infection both in his lungs and urinary tract, and his urine was bright red. Dr. Wheat also said he had no idea what caused this infection, and he needed Ann's help to try to figure it out. Ann was not one to leave a mystery unsolved, so she had agreed to stay a bit longer to help Dr. Wheat. Ann checked the results of the test she had performed on Edward's blood, and the sample showed only one abnormality. Edward had tested positive for a bacteria called Serratia marcescens. Ann thought that was odd. She had heard about this bacteria before. She knew it was sometimes used to conduct experiments in laboratories, but they didn't use it at this hospital. Beyond that, she had never heard of anybody using it anywhere in the Bay Area. And so quickly, she grabbed a medical textbook off the shelf and thumbed through it to the right page that talked about this bacteria. It said that S. marcescens was usually harmless. According to the textbook, the bacteria was indeed sometimes used in classrooms for experiments, and also critically, the bacteria also produced a red pigment. And so Ann thought that must explain our patient's bright red urine. However, this bacteria did not explain Edward's lung infection. It did explain the potential urinary tract infection, because basically it showed he didn't have a UTI. Instead, the red urine was this pigment from the bacteria. But this bacteria, S. marcescens, was supposed to be harmless and was not in any way tied to lung infections. So why was this typically benign bacteria apparently making Edward so sick? Furthermore, how did he even come in contact with it? Since no one in the hospital used the bacteria, how could it have made its way into Edward's bloodstream? Anne wasn't sure what to make of this, but she hoped Dr. Wheat might have some ideas. So she hurried over to the phone and dialed his number at home. 3 weeks later, Dr. Wheat walked quickly down the halls of the hospital. That morning, his patient, Edward Nevin Sr., had died. Dr. Wheat had done everything he could to try to help Edward fight this mystery infection that was attacking his body. He had prescribed what he thought was the correct regimen of antibiotics, but unfortunately, Edward was just too frail. The infection eventually made its way to his already weakened heart, and it killed him. Dr. Wheat was crushed that he had not been able to save Edward's life, but right now, he couldn't focus on that. Instead, he had to focus on the slew of other patients at this hospital who now also were showing all the same symptoms as Edward Nevin. They were showing the apparent urinary tract infection mixed with pneumonia-like symptoms and also the red urine. And also, of those new patients, of which there were 8 by this point, they all tested positive for S. marcescens. Dr. Wheat was baffled, as was everybody else. How was this supposedly harmless bacteria making his patients so sick? And where was it coming from? And they were getting new cases every day. And the weird thing was, this hospital was the only place that was dealing with this strange outbreak. The patients they were getting seemingly had nothing in common except that they all lived in San Francisco, and each of them had undergone a recent medical procedure at Stanford University Hospital prior to presenting with red urine. And so now, Dr. Wheat and Anne, the lab technician, were terrified that these infections were coming from somewhere inside the hospital. Dr. Wheat checked in on the youngest of the S. marcescens patients, a 29-year-old woman. Originally, she had been admitted to the hospital a week earlier for a knee operation, but following the operation, she developed these mysterious symptoms. The woman smiled weakly as Dr. Wheat checked her vitals, but despite her smile, the doctor knew she was in a great deal of pain. Dr. Wheat couldn't believe that an otherwise healthy young woman was so affected by this mystery infection. The pneumonia symptoms shared amongst the patients indicated that they may have somehow inhaled this bacteria. But that didn't make any sense. S. marcescens was not some toxic fume. It was a harmless lab culture. There was no reason for it to be floating around in the air, especially the air in a hospital that didn't use or study that particular bacteria at all, which genuinely frightened Dr. Wheat. If they couldn't figure out where this bacteria was coming from, there'd be no way to stop it. Almost exactly a year later, in October of 1951, Dr. Wheat was in his office at the hospital, and he felt a strange mix of pride and anxiety as he flipped through a copy of the AMA Archives of Internal Medicine. Inside was a report that he had co-authored with Ann Zuckerman, the lab technician, about the S. marcescens outbreak. Dr. Wheat thought back to a year earlier. In total, they had had 11 people show up with this mystery illness. The 11 patients ranged in age from 29 years old to 78 years old. Despite the tragedy of Edward's death, Dr. Wheat and Anne took solace in the fact that no other patients died. They experienced painful, difficult symptoms, but everyone else infected with this bacteria eventually made a full recovery. To contain the outbreak, the hospital had cleaned its equipment and kept the S. marcescens patients totally isolated. Thankfully, they didn't have any more cases after that. Dr. Wheat actually suspected at the time that there may have been more San Francisco residents with this bacteria in their bloodstream. However, they just never got sick enough to actually need hospitalization. And so despite the outbreak coming to an end, Dr. Wheat still had 2 big questions that were left unanswered. How did S. marcescens cause these infections? And perhaps most puzzling of all, where did the S. marcescens come from? Dr. Wheat set the medical journal back down on his desk. He and Anne had written the article in this journal to bring these nagging questions out into the public. Now, with their article published, he hoped that somebody would reach out and help him solve this mystery. Unfortunately, though, nobody ever reached out. "25 years later, on December 22nd, 1976, medical malpractice lawyer Edward Nevin III, the grandson of Dr. Wheat's patient Edward Nevin Sr., walked into his own office in San Francisco feeling very festive. He was eager to finish up a few last cases before the Christmas holiday. Edward III had only just sat down when his phone rang. He figured it was one of his clients, so he picked up. The voice on the other end of the line introduced himself as Robert Bartlett. He was a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle on the local stories beat. Edward was surprised by the call. He was just a small-time lawyer. What did a journalist want from him? Robert asked Edward if he had read the newspaper that day. Edward said no, he had not had time. Robert told him to pick up the paper and look on page 3. So Edward actually reached over and grabbed a nearby newspaper, opened it up, and he saw a shocking headline. And suddenly a terrible clarity settled over him. After a quarter century, Edward and his family now finally had an explanation for what actually happened to his grandfather. The headline on page 3 read, "Army Tested Biological War in San Francisco." The S. marcescens outbreak in San Francisco was not just some chance infection. Edward's grandfather and the other 10 patients were the victims of a biochemical attack, and the United States Army was behind it. On September 26, 1950, as part of a weapons test, Army officials aerosolized the bacteria S. marcescens and sprayed it directly into the San Francisco fog near the Stanford University Hospital. 2 days later, Edward Nevin developed all of his symptoms, the first known case of an S. marcescens infection in the city. At the time, America was in the midst of the Cold War, and the American government was very concerned about the threat of a Soviet biochemical weapon, and were eager to test how such an attack would affect the United States. From 1949 to 1969, the United States conducted over 200 experiments to assess the threat of biochemical weapons in highly populated areas. Shockingly, it performed these experiments on its own people, using American citizens as unwitting guinea pigs. Now, the Army claimed these tests would be harmless. However, many of the substances they used to test these potential attacks had dangerous effects, like Serratia marcescens. In San Francisco specifically, the S. marcescens experiment was titled Operation Sea Spray. Army officials sprayed S. marcescens into the fog to see how weather might spread a weaponized bacteria. Perhaps the thinking was that the government would be able to track how many people this affected by monitoring if anybody mentioned having bright red urine, which was alarming but not overall harmful. However, the government did not anticipate the much more dangerous symptoms that came with S. marcescens infection. The U.S. Army scientists believed the S. marcescens bacteria was entirely harmless, and they chose not to report their experiments to health officials. However, when the news broke about the S. marcescens outbreak, and when the news broke that Edward Nevin had died as a result of it, the Army continued utilizing S. marcescens in dozens of tests in cities all across America. The Army's experiments were eventually stopped in 1969, when President Nixon issued an executive order banning chemical and biological weapons testing. In 1977, 27 years after Operation Sea Spray began, the Army finally admitted to spreading the S. marcescens bacteria in San Francisco. However, they maintained that the S. marcescens infections that occurred during the time the experiment was happening were purely coincidental. Now, this did not sit right with Edward Nevin's family or any of the other victims involved in the S. marcescens outbreak. But Nevin's family actually sued the government for wrongful death. Their case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. But ultimately, the courts decided there was insufficient evidence that Nevin's death was actually caused by Operation Sea Spray.
Hey basketball fans, Steve Nash here. Ready to elevate your basketball IQ? I'm teaming up with LeBron James to bring you the latest season of Mind the Game. And we're about to take you deeper into basketball than you've ever gone before. We're breaking down the real game, the X's and O's that actually matter. In every episode, we'll share elite-level strategy, dive into career-defining moments, and explain the why behind plays that change a game, a team, or a championship. LeBron and I have lived this game at the highest level for decades. We've been in those pressure moments and made those game-changing decisions and learned from the greatest basketball minds in history. Now we're pulling back the curtain and sharing that knowledge with you. Time to go beyond the highlights and get into the real heart of basketball. Watch Mind the Game now on YouTube, Prime Video, or listen wherever you get your podcasts.
In 1993, 3 8-year-old boys were brutally murdered in West Memphis, Arkansas. As the small-town local police struggled to solve the crime, rumors soon spread that the killings were the work of a satanic cult. Suspicion landed on 3 local teenagers, but there was no real evidence linking them to the murders. Still, that would not protect them. Hi, I'm Lindsey Graham, the host of Wondery's show American Scandal. We bring to life some of the biggest controversies in U.S. history, presidential lies, environmental disasters, corporate fraud. In our latest series, 3 teenage boys are falsely accused of a vicious triple homicide. But their story doesn't end with their trials or convictions. Instead, their plight will capture the imagination of the entire country and spark a campaign for justice that will last for almost 2 decades. Follow American Scandal on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes of American Scandal, The West Memphis 3, early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus.
And now, here's our next story, Weather Warriors, for Redacted. In August 1963, a crowd of Buddhists gathered in a town square in Hue, a city in South Vietnam. Their protest was a silent one, but there was a palpable energy in the air. They were determined not to be beaten. Even though Buddhists comprise over 70% of South Vietnam's population, the president, Ngo Dinh Diem, had instituted a series of repressive policies against them. Months earlier, during a protest against a ban on Buddhist flags, 9 unarmed protesters were killed by the army. Since then, the Buddhists had carried out relentless, nonviolent gatherings. A number of monks had even set themselves on fire in protest of the president. From a 4th-floor balcony across the street, an American was keeping a close eye on the protest below. It didn't bother him that they had assembled, but as an agent of the CIA, he had orders to disband them. He watched as local police marched in against the protesters. They threw tear gas canisters into the crowd, sending clouds of vapor billowing up into the square. Many of the protesters started to cough, but most of them held their ground. The CIA agent knew they were going to need something stronger to get the protesters to leave. Then his radio crackled to life. A voice came through, asking for permission to take off. The agent picked up the receiver and gave the order. Their mission was a go. A few minutes later, the faint sound of an American carrier plane's engines zoomed overhead. It had become an awfully common sound over the past few months, and no one paid it much mind, except for the CIA agent. Gripping the receiver tightly in his fist, he looked up into the sky, his heart thrumming with nervous excitement. The scientist who had briefed the agent on the mission assured him it was possible. Still, until he saw it with his own eyes, it felt more like fantasy than reality. The plane passed over the square, and moments later, the sky darkened. The protesters looked up as the first fat drops of rain fell on them. From there, the rain steadily grew heavier. Within a few minutes, it was pouring, and the crowd scattered. The agent looked on, stunned by what he'd just seen. It actually worked. The protesters didn't respond to tear gas, but there must have been something about the rain that caused them to leave. Whatever the reason, the United States now had control of the weather, and they could use it anytime they wanted. The United States government has a long history of attempting to harness weather for use in warfare. In 1871, Civil War General Edward Powers published a book speculating that large-scale battles had an impact on the climate. The following year, Congress gave him $10,000 to fire cannons into the sky in Texas, hoping they would cause rain. His experiments were unsuccessful, but the government never gave up its quest to control the elements. A century later, as the Cold War simmered through the 1960s and 70s, the United States military launched a new series of experimental operations. This story follows one of them. It was called Operation Popeye and was used during the Vietnam War. The U.S. Army experimented with a scientific technique called cloud seeding to increase rainfall in areas the North Vietnamese Army traveled. But the practice had unintended consequences for both humans and the environment. And when the operation was leaked to the public, the military was forced to reckon with the fallout. In early 1967, almost 4 years after the initial test to break up a Buddhist protest in South Vietnam, Lieutenant Colonel Ed Soyster was stuck in a stuffy meeting room at the Pentagon. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were arguing once again about how to stop the Viet Cong. They'd been at it for a while. Ed sat by and held his tongue, but it wasn't easy. As the operations officer of a battalion stationed in Vietnam, he was one of the few men in the room with on-the-ground experience during the war. As his superiors squabbled over different strategies, all Ed could think about were the potential lives lost. The men who would die because of their plans, many who never wanted to serve in the first place. Still, Ed was a good soldier. He wasn't going to speak out of turn or contradict his bosses. He would wait until they asked him for his perspective. One of the top advisors hammered home that the military needed to target the Viet Cong supply route, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The trail was a network of jungle roads and tunnels that stretched 1,000 miles through Vietnam and dipped into Laos and Cambodia. It allowed the Viet Cong to move throughout the region almost undetected. The Joint Chiefs lamented that they had tried almost everything to stop the Viet Cong from using the trail. Deforestation, deploying Agent Orange from helicopters, even carpet bombing hadn't been effective. They were running out of options. There was only one thing they hadn't tried yet. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was only accessible for part of the year. During monsoon season, it became pure mud. The tunnels were flooded, and the bridges would get washed out. If they could stretch the rainy season a bit longer, it could increase their chances of crippling the Viet Cong. And it just so happened that the U.S. military had discovered a way to do precisely that. The secretive program was known as Operation Popeye, and it employed a new method of weather control called cloud seeding, a means of increasing atmospheric density and creating rain. The military had already successfully tested it in South Vietnam, which meant cloud seeding was ready for use on the battlefield. Ed remained expressionless, but inside, his mind was reeling. As a scientist himself, he had only heard rumors about the practice, but didn't think it was actually feasible. After the Joint Chiefs agreed that cloud seeding was their best option, they needed to select someone dependable to execute the program, someone with a background in science, someone with on-the-ground experience in Vietnam. They slowly turned to Ed Soyster. He swallowed hard. He'd never been put in charge of anything like this. But he would never turn down such an important assignment, especially one that came directly from the most senior military leaders in the country. He saluted and accepted his mission. The weather in Vietnam was now under his command. A few months later, in the fall of 1967, an American pilot walked down an airstrip carved out of the jungle in Thailand. He looked up at the sky. The sun was finally peeking through the clouds. After months of monsoons, he was grateful to finally have a break in the weather. He knew it wouldn't last long, though, not if his orders from Lieutenant Colonel Ed Soyster were to be believed. Because today, he wasn't going to be dropping napalm on the jungle or Agent Orange. He was going to be dropping rain. The pilot climbed into the cockpit of his C-130. He turned the engines on and radioed control. He was cleared for takeoff. A few minutes later, he was flying over the jungles of Vietnam. He scanned his instruments as he navigated to his drop point. Lieutenant Colonel Soyster had been clear. This needed to be precise. As the pilot approached his target, he flew lower, dipping close to the trees. Below him was nothing but thick jungle and a few wisps of clouds. He positioned his finger on the trigger and took a deep breath. He'd been briefed on how cloud seeding worked, and it was making him more anxious than any of the bombs he'd ever dropped. The moment arrived, and the pilot pulled the trigger. Several metal canisters ejected from the plane. They immediately burst into flames, spewing millions of particles of silver iodide and lead iodide into the air. As the particles dispersed through the clouds, atmospheric water clung to them tightly. These particles would amass more and more water, making the clouds larger and darker, and soon enough, they would be ready to burst. The pilot veered right and turned back toward his home airstrip. He looked behind him and could barely believe what he saw. It was actually starting to rain. And far below, on the jungle floor, the Ho Chi Minh Trail would soon turn to deep, impassable mud. Operation Popeye was fully underway. Four years later, on the morning of March 18, 1971, Dennis J. Doolin woke up with a headache. As the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Doolin had a lot on his plate. The war in Vietnam was now in its 7th year, with no signs of slowing down. Doolin's job was to help manage the flow of resources and troops to South Vietnam. But no matter how many bombs, weapons, or young men he sent over the Pacific, it didn't seem to be making a difference. He sat down at the kitchen table, trying to clear his head as he ate breakfast. It was one of the few moments each day he could take to relax. As his wife poured him a cup of coffee, Doolin opened up the Washington Post, and his Danish dropped out of his mouth. Jack Anderson had written a column about a secret U.S. Army program that controlled the weather. Anderson was a legendary reporter who had covered everything from the Chappaquiddick incident, where Senator Ted Kennedy accidentally killed one of his staffers, to the time President Nixon invited Elvis Presley to the White House. And now he had blown the lid off another bombshell story, Operation Popeye. Anderson reported that the program had been running for years with unintended side effects. The increased rainfall caused by the cloud seeding had washed away several villages in Laos. Doolin was steaming. He was high up in the Department of Defense, but he hadn't even known about this program. He sipped his coffee, trying to get a grip. As if the war wasn't going bad enough already, now he had a PR disaster on his hands. Right on cue, the phone on the wall began to ring. Doolin felt a pang of fear in his stomach. It was probably one of his bosses, demanding to know how the story got out. He marched over and picked up the receiver. Instead, it turned out to be a reporter from the New York Times. He asked Doolin what he thought about Anderson's story. Through gritted teeth, Doolin replied, "No comment," and hung up. Doolin's wife asked him what was going on. She was used to seeing him frustrated with the news, but she could tell he was more bothered than usual. He sat back down at the kitchen table, trying to collect his thoughts. The American public already felt lied to about what the military was doing in Vietnam. But Operation Popeye was different. It was going to scare people. They were going to demand answers, which Doolin didn't have. On March 20th, 1974, Rhode Island Senator Claiborne Pell leaned forward in his chair. He watched carefully as representatives from the Department of Defense filed into the hearing room. His frown deepened as he saw Dennis Doolin and Ed Soyster take their seats. It was almost 3 years to the day after Jack Anderson's first article about cloud seeding was published, and a year after U.S. troops had left Vietnam. The country wanted answers for the war, and for Operation Popeye in particular. Senator Pell wanted answers too. This hearing, held in secret, was a first step towards getting clarity about the program. Senator Pell adjusted the mic and launched into his questions. He looked down sternly at Doolin and Soyster and demanded to know what the military was doing with the weather in Vietnam. He asked why on earth newspapers like the Washington Post had a better picture of the story than the United States Senate. Doolin shuffled uncomfortably in his seat. He assured the senator that he also had no knowledge of Operation Popeye until the Post's article. Pell's eyes shifted to Soyster. He demanded to know why the Thai and Laotian governments weren't informed on specifics. Soyster cleared his throat. He began by assuring the committee members that the cloud seeding program was both safe for the environment and effective in deterring use of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Beyond that, he only gave a vague response about the security risk of informing American allies about the cloud seeding program, and he wouldn't give specifics about why the operation had been kept under such a tight lid. Pell shook his head. This was typical. As a retired naval man himself, he knew a strategic non-answer when he heard one. He leaned into his microphone to make himself clear. This was what scared him, not the cloud seeding, but the secrecy. The military could have any number of programs that Congress had no idea about. It could not operate with such little oversight. Pell pressed on. He asked the men if there were any other weather control operations underway. What about hurricanes, typhoons? Doolin shook his head. The science to manipulate those kinds of weather events didn't exist. And in his opinion, contrary to Soyster's account, Operation Popeye hadn't even made much of a difference during the war. The Army's interest in controlling the weather was over. Pell raised an eyebrow. Doolin himself said he had no knowledge of Operation Popeye until Anderson's article was published, and his boss, Defense Secretary Melvin Laird, had lied to Congress when the story broke, denying the existence of the entire operation. So how could he possibly believe Doolin when he said that the Army had no additional projects aimed at controlling the weather? The men did their best to assure Pell they were telling the truth, but the senator wasn't convinced. He gave Doolin and Soyster their marching orders. Operation Popeye needed to be declassified. If the Army truly had nothing to hide, it was time the entire project was made public. Doolin and Soyster nodded. Pell called an end to the hearing, but as he got up from his chair, something still bothered him. He felt the Army was playing a dangerous game. They seemed to have completely ignored regulations and alliances in the pursuit of a potentially hazardous new technology. Perhaps it was time to go a step further and ban weather control as a weapon altogether, before the Army took it too far. Operation Popeye was declassified 2 months after the secret Senate hearing. The newly revealed details of the project ruffled feathers in the intelligence community. The implications of the U.S. military manning such a wide-reaching program without full transparency raised alarm bells. It also worsened Americans' faith in their government, which was already low due to the Vietnam War. Anti-war activists were shocked at how callously the military had treated American allies in the region, particularly after leaks revealed that the Army had covertly bombed Cambodia and Laos. The destruction of Laotian villages during the cloud seeding operation was widely condemned, and many environmental activists were disturbed by the implications of Operation Popeye. Silver iodide and lead iodide can be potentially toxic, especially to sea animals. Though Lieutenant Colonel Ed Soyster maintained to the Senate that the cloud seeding program was fully safe for the environment, the government had known about the negative impact that the operation could have on the region's crops. Following the backlash, Senator Claiborne Pell helped pass a resolution urging the government to pursue an international treaty against weather modification. In 1976, the United Nations signed the Environmental Modification Convention. The use of weather control for any hostile purpose remains banned to this day. When the truth about Operation Popeye came to light, the country was already deeply shaken. The Vietnam War had been a failure. Watergate had shattered illusions of presidential integrity, and Richard Nixon had become the first U.S. president to resign in disgrace. Trust in government was in freefall, so when the public learned that the U.S. military had been trying to manipulate the weather as a tool of war, it fit neatly into the growing sense that those in charge were willing to do anything and tell the public nothing. The impulse to question power is healthy, even patriotic. But when answers are withheld, suspicion and speculation fill the void. That's how we get from cloud seeding in Vietnam to full-blown conspiracy theories about things like mind-controlling chemtrails from jet exhaust or space lasers that cause hurricanes. Ironically, the government's efforts to conceal the truth often end up feeding the very paranoia they're meant to prevent. The less transparent institutions are, the more room there is for wild theories to flourish. And over time, these fantasies don't just distort reality. They chip away at our ability to act collectively, to trust one another, and to hold power accountable in any meaningful way. What Operation Popeye reminds us is this: secrecy may serve short-term goals, but in the long run, it has a cost. Because in a system built on public trust, the truth doesn't just matter. It's the only thing that can hold the country together.
In early 2001, 32-year-old Alex Algueri stood behind the front desk at the Dolphin Fitness Club in Amityville, New York. Alex loved the sounds of a crowded gym, the music pumping through the speakers, weights sliding onto bars, and people cheering each other on as they hit their fitness goals. And a crowded gym also meant that Alex was making money. He and his best friend, Paul Riedel, had opened up Dolphin Fitness 2 years earlier, and they had turned it into a favorite spot for serious weightlifters and amateur weightlifters alike. There was no question Alex was happy about all the money he was bringing in. He'd always dreamed of being a very successful entrepreneur, but the gym was a lot more to him than just a business. Amityville was a small town on Long Island with a strong sense of community, and Alex wanted his and Paul's gym to reflect that. So from the day they had opened Dolphin Fitness, Alex said he wanted everybody who stepped through the doors to feel like they were part of a family. It didn't matter if people were old or young or what kind of shape they were in. Alex went out of his way to help his customers feel good about themselves and to feel like they belonged, and his customers loved him for it. Alex stepped out from behind the front desk and began making his rounds on the gym floor. Alex was a really strong guy. He was just about 6 feet, maybe a little bit under, but he looked like a very serious bodybuilder, super jacked. So most people at the gym called him Big Al. Alex had dark hair and a dark goatee, and on this day he was wearing a long-sleeve black shirt and tight jeans, his standard outfit at work. Alex said hello to just about everybody on the gym floor. He knew pretty much everybody by name. And he was excited to see some new members starting off the new year by coming to his gym. Just then, a young man waved at Alex and asked if he wouldn't mind coming over and spotting him on the bench. And Alex said that was fine, and he walked over to the bench press, and Alex told the young man he'd be ready to grab the bar if the young man struggled to lift it. So the young man took a deep breath, he grabbed the bar, brought it down to his chest, and then in one slow but steady movement, he pressed the bar all the way up, and Alex spotted him the whole time shouting words of encouragement, and then finally when the young man had fully extended his arms and fully did a rep, he racked the bar, and he and Alex exchanged high fives and cheered like he just won the Super Bowl or something. Just then, Alex turned and saw a couple of people standing by the front desk. He figured they were potential new members. So Alex scanned the gym and then just shook his head. His partner Paul was supposed to be here right now working too, and really it would have been his job to talk to these two new potential members, but Alex hadn't seen Paul on the gym floor in hours. So Alex walked away from the young man he had just spotted and headed over to the front desk and smiled wide and greeted the couple. The rest of that night pretty much went the same way. Alex did everything and ran the gym, and Paul didn't show his face again. And by the end of the night, after Alex had said goodbye to the last customers and locked up, he was feeling frustrated. Why should he do all the work but still give Paul half the profits? Alex angrily marched his way towards the back of the gym, past some aerobics rooms to a small office. Alex knew this is where he would find Paul. Alex opened the door, and there was Paul hunched over in a chair and tapping his fingers on a table. Paul didn't look up when Alex walked in. It was like he was off in his own world. Alex figured Paul must be high on cocaine or some other drug. It was a sight that Alex saw way too often. It made him mad because Paul was his business partner and he wasn't doing his job. But it also broke Alex's heart because Paul really was his best friend, and to see him struggle like this was hard. The two men had known each other for years, and they'd gotten along from the first time they'd met. They'd both grown up as working-class kids who dreamed of having their own business someday, and they both loved lifting weights and bodybuilding. So after becoming fast friends, they began to come up with a plan to open their own gym. For years, Alex and Paul had worked different jobs to save up money, and they had also found some outside investors who believed in them. And so eventually, when they had scraped all the cash together, they opened up Dolphin Fitness together. Now, most people who knew them said these two were closer than brothers. Alex had been Paul's best man at his wedding, and he was the godfather to Paul and his wife Leanne's baby boy. Back in the office, Alex shouted Paul's name, and Paul finally realized Alex was in the room with him. When Paul turned around and looked up, Alex could see his eyes were totally bloodshot. Alex really laid into Paul for not helping him run the gym that night, and he said he didn't understand what Paul was even doing with his life. They had achieved their dream of starting their own business. And on top of that, Paul had a beautiful wife and child, so why was he throwing everything away on drugs and partying like he was still a crazy bachelor in his early 20s? Paul was very defensive and shouted a few obscenities at Alex, and then basically just told Alex to leave him alone. But Alex said he'd had enough. He told Paul that he was ready to dissolve their business partnership and go start his own gym if he had to. That got Paul's attention. He stood up and walked right towards Alex. And Alex was a big guy, but Paul was like a giant. Paul was 6 foot 7 inches tall with a massive chest and huge arms. And Paul just started screaming, and Alex screamed right back. But Alex knew Paul was not someone to mess with when he was high and also angry. So pretty quickly, Alex just said he was done talking for the night, and he walked out of the office. From the hallway, Alex heard Paul scream at the top of his lungs, and then he heard the sound of an office chair go flying into the wall. Alex angrily clenched his jaw, picked up his pace, and grabbed his coat from behind the front desk. Then he headed out the back door of the gym to the parking lot, he climbed into his black Yukon SUV, and took off. And as he drove, he figured Paul was still probably screaming and throwing more furniture. The following day at the gym, Paul apologized to Alex. Alex was used to this. His friend would do drugs, he would lash out, say stupid things, and then feel bad about it the next day and say he was sorry. Alex accepted Paul's apology like he always did, but he just felt tired from having to deal with the same thing over and over again. Alex was all about family, and he loved the people close to him almost unconditionally. But even he was reaching a breaking point with Paul, and he knew he was not the only one who felt this way. Paul's wife, Leanne, was also fed up with Paul's drug use and angry outbursts. In fact, she was so upset with her husband that she'd gone to stay with her mother in Florida until she could figure out if she even wanted to stay married. Alex knew that Leanne leaving had made it really hard on Paul, but he couldn't blame her. After all, the night before, Alex had threatened to leave Paul and go start his own gym. And Alex had meant what he said, but he knew scrapping the Dolphin Fitness Club and trying to start his own gym would not happen overnight. So Alex decided to look at all of his options and start putting together a new business plan. That way he would feel like he was working towards something. And in the meantime, he hoped and prayed that Paul would get his life together and go back to being the great business partner and best friend that he used to be. A couple of weeks later, on the night of January 17th, 2001, Alex was back behind the front desk at the gym. Paul had taken a couple of nights off, which left Alex to run the place on his own. But Alex was used to that, and he really hoped the time away from the gym would do Paul some good. Alex made his usual rounds on the gym floor, talking to customers and encouraging the weightlifters, and then at some point he heard a woman who was over on the exercise machines shout "Big Al" over the music. Alex turned and smiled at the woman and began walking over to her. When he reached her, she was very sweaty and out of breath, and she told him right away how excited she was about all the results she was seeing from all her exercising, but she told Alex that she just could not get on board with the music that was playing, and could he please change it? Alex laughed and said of course he would change it, but she told him there was actually this one particular album that really motivated her to work even harder at the gym. And she said Alex had played it during a fitness class that she'd taken from him. And immediately Alex knew exactly the song she was talking about. He said he had the CD in his car and he'd just go grab it. Then he turned away from the woman and began walking towards the back door. The cold air hit Alex as soon as he walked out to the parking lot. It was around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, so just above freezing. Alex's coat was still hanging up inside the gym, but it wasn't worth going back for. He'd spent enough winters in Amityville to be used to this kind of cold. So Alex hustled across the parking lot to his black Yukon. When he got to it, he opened up the driver's side door and the dome light came on. Alex leaned into the SUV and started digging through the CDs that he kept in a case in the passenger seat. Then Alex heard someone shouting behind him in the parking lot, so he pulled his head out of the SUV and he turned to see what was going on, and when he did, he saw someone running directly towards him in the darkness. Back inside the gym, the woman who had asked Alex to change the music, she wiped the sweat from her forehead and looked off towards the back exit. Alex had been gone way longer than she thought he would be, but she figured he must be just having a hard time finding the CD, or maybe he'd stopped in his office to make a phone call before coming back to the gym floor. But then the woman saw something, and she screamed. Several people stopped their workouts and ran to her to see if she was okay, but she just pointed towards the back of the gym, and then more screams rang out above the music. Alex staggered onto the gym floor. Blood poured down his neck and soaked through his shirt. People ran up to him and he looked at them, and in a strangled voice he said, "I've been shot." Alex collapsed to the ground. A woman who was a nurse rushed to his side and checked his pulse and immediately began administering CPR. At the same time, a man ran to the front desk and grabbed the phone and dialed 911. A few minutes later, police and paramedics arrived at the gym. and right away Alex was put on a gurney and rushed outside to a waiting ambulance. Someone had turned off the music by this point, so everybody in the gym just stood there in stunned silence. Most of them were in shock, and they couldn't understand what had even just happened. Everybody loved Alex. Why would someone shoot him? The local police stayed to question everybody at the gym about what they had seen, but their main goal was simply just to get names and contact information for everybody who was there. They knew that a violent crime like this one, that had seemingly just occurred, would quickly be handed off to a larger police force, and so they just wanted to gather up some names to hand off. A couple of hours later, Detective Robert Anderson of the Suffolk County Police Department stepped out of his car in front of the hospital. Anderson looked and dressed more like a professor than a cop, and people who had worked with Anderson during his 34 years in law enforcement said he had a mind like a professor too. He was highly analytical and rarely satisfied with simple answers. Detective Anderson had gotten word that Alex Algieri had been shot outside of the gym that he owned, and Alex had been declared dead soon after being rushed to the hospital. From the minute Anderson was told he would be leading a homicide investigation in Amityville, he knew there would be a ton of pressure on him to solve the case fast, because Amityville was not your typical town. Amityville, for decades, had been associated with murder and dark forces. Almost 30 years earlier, in 1974, an Amityville man named Ronald DeFeo Jr. had killed his mother, father, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters in their home. The media attention from the mass murder was bad enough for the small, quiet town, but things had only gotten stranger for Amityville after that. The family that wound up moving into the DeFeo house where those murders happened claimed they were terrorized by a demon or some other supernatural entity in the house. This claim eventually drew the attention of very famous paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, who came out and did their own investigation, and the story of this demon or entity in the home also was eventually turned into a book called The Amityville Horror. And that book has since been spun off into movies and TV shows. I mean, Amityville really became synonymous with evil. And so Detective Anderson knew that Amityville community leaders had worked really hard over the years to kind of correct their image. They didn't want to be known as this violent or cursed town. But this brutal shooting in a gym parking lot threatened to put Amityville right back in the national news for all the wrong reasons. Anderson walked into the hospital and found his way to the private room where Alex's father was waiting for him. Alex's father wiped tears from his face, cleared his throat, and introduced himself to Anderson. But before Alex's father could say much more than his name, he broke down in tears again. Even after 34 years as a cop and dealing with some of the most notorious murders on Long Island, nothing could really prepare Anderson for meeting a parent who had just lost their child. It was the worst kind of loss Anderson could imagine, and seeing Alex's father in so much pain really hit him hard. He told Alex's father how sorry he was for his loss. Then Anderson said he hated to put him on the spot at that moment, but he did need to know if there was anyone who might have wanted to hurt his son. Alex's father wiped away his tears and then told Anderson that Alex was the sweetest, kindest man you'd ever meet, and that everybody who knew him really loved him. But then he said there definitely was one person who could have done this to his son: Alex's best friend and business partner, Paul Riedel. It turned out Alex had told his father all about Paul's drug use and his partying, and he had also told him that he was thinking about scrapping the business with Paul and going out on his own. Anderson thanked Alex's father for his help and told him how sorry he was again. Then Anderson left the hospital and drove back to the station. He wanted to gather as much information as he could on Paul. It didn't take long for Detective Anderson to discover that Paul had had more than his fair share of run-ins with the law. He had served time in prison for drug charges and armed robbery, and he had previously been linked to an illegal sports gambling ring. But Anderson knew that did not mean the man had killed his best friend. So for the time, Anderson put Paul's police record to the side and dug more into his personal life and his relationship with Alex. The local Amityville police had passed along contact information for everybody they found at the gym when they had first arrived there. And when Anderson and his team reached out to those people, they all said pretty much the same thing. Alex was like family, and everybody loved him. But Paul, he was a mess, and he definitely was capable of shooting Alex. Some of Alex's family and closest friends were even more straightforward when they spoke to Anderson. They said they were sure Paul had to be the murderer. So Anderson knew he would just have to go talk to Paul, but he didn't want to drag Paul to the station and chuck him inside of an interrogation room just yet, because he feared as soon as he did that, all of Amityville would decide Paul really was guilty. And so that could potentially destroy an innocent man's life, and it could put even more pressure on police to arrest someone before they were actually ready. So Anderson actually came up with a fairly outside-the-box way to question Paul that was not super formal. Now, it was not going to be ideal by any means, but it was an opportunity Anderson didn't want to miss. His team would talk to Paul at Alex's funeral. Days after Alex's murder, a line of cars stretched out down the street in front of a local funeral home, and they wrapped around the corner. Hundreds of people had come to pay their last respects to Alex. Detective Anderson filed into the funeral home behind a group of mourners. It was common for investigators to attend funerals for homicide victims. It gave them a chance to watch how potential suspects acted. But Anderson was really just there to observe Paul, and to see if he could get any information from Paul after the service was over. Anderson watched as Paul made his way to the front of the chapel inside of the funeral home. And it immediately became clear to Anderson that it didn't matter to other people that Paul had not been brought in for questioning yet. Clearly, they had already decided Paul was guilty. People literally shouted at Paul as he walked down the aisle towards his best friend's coffin. They told him to leave and said how dare he show his face here. Paul didn't engage with any of them. He just stared at the floor and clung to his wife Leanne as he walked. Detective Anderson couldn't get over how small this enormous guy seemed to look at this very moment. But Anderson didn't know if he should feel sorry for Paul or if he was just being too cautious and too analytical. Maybe everybody else was right. Maybe this case was clear-cut and Paul really was the killer. Anderson watched as Alex's friends and family talked about how much Alex had meant to them and how proud they had been of him. Alex's father fought back tears and spoke about all the special times he'd shared with his son. Then he broke down and said Alex would never get to experience those kind of moments with a child of his own because someone had taken that chance away from him. After the funeral was over, Anderson and some other members of his team separated from the throng of mourners and followed Paul and his wife Leanne outside. The investigators approached, and as they did, Paul suddenly stood up to his full height. Suddenly, the small, kind of sad-looking man Anderson had seen inside had disappeared. Paul now looked angry and huge. Clearly, he did not like the fact that police were bothering him at his best friend's funeral. Anderson assured Paul they were only trying to get some basic information. So Paul just said he loved Alex, he would never hurt him, and on the night of the murder, he said he was with friends in another town. For a minute, Anderson figured his big plan to try to question Paul at this funeral was going to turn into a total bust. But right as he was about to give up on this approach, something suddenly stood out to him. Paul's wife, Leanne, was standing next to her husband doing her part as a very supportive spouse. But Anderson had briefly spoken to Leanne in the days following the murder, so he knew that she and Paul had serious problems in their marriage and that she had even gone to Florida to get away from Paul. And so now Anderson wanted to know if she had had like a big change of heart about her husband, which is why she was now being so supportive, or if she was acting supportive out of fear. If Paul had really killed Alex and Leanne knew about it, was she just afraid she'd be next if she didn't support him? On January 23, 2001, so 6 days after the murder, Detective Anderson met with Leanne at her grandmother's house in a small town that was not too far from Amityville. Leanne was short and thin with long brown hair, and she sounded like a native New Yorker. She led Anderson into a warm, rustic-looking kitchen, and they sat down at the table. Anderson didn't want Leanne to feel like she was being interrogated, so when he spoke to her like they were just two friends catching up. Anderson asked Leanne about the funeral and how she felt when she was there, and very quickly she made it clear that she had not gone there out of fear or anything like that. She had been there because she loved her friend Alex, and she wanted to support her husband Paul. She said that despite their marital issues, they really had been working hard on their marriage. But Anderson wasn't convinced, and so he pressed Leanne a bit, and he asked what had happened that made her leave New York and go to Florida in the first place. Leanne said she'd left because Paul was partying and doing drugs, and she felt like that was a terrible environment for her kid. But Leanne was clear that she did not believe Paul would ever kill his friend Alex. Sure, the two men fought sometimes, but they were like brothers, and brothers fight. She knew Paul loved Alex. Anderson said he understood, and then he asked her if there was anything else she could think of that might help with the investigation. Leanne shifted in her chair and then looked around the room like she was trying to make sure nobody else was listening. Then she leaned closer to Anderson, and in a quiet voice, she told him there was something going on that he needed to know about. Paul had gotten into trouble with the mob, and he had actually received a rat card in the mail. Anderson hid his surprise pretty well, but this was news to him. He knew Paul had a police record and that he'd been linked to some low-level criminals who might have loose ties to the mob. But receiving a rat card meant that members of the mob believed Paul had sold them out to the police, an unforgivable offense in the world of organized crime. Then Leanne told Anderson that things had actually gotten even worse after that. At a big party a year earlier, Paul had gotten into this big public argument with a man who wound up being a captain in the Gambino organized crime family. At the time, the Gambinos were one of the most powerful mafia organizations in New York City. Leanne said Paul never told her what the argument was about, but she was pretty sure he owed a lot of money to some very powerful people. Detective Anderson listened quietly, and he still didn't show anything on his face, but he knew this case might have just taken a major turn. It was one thing for Paul to be connected to some small-time criminals in Amityville, New York, but it was a whole different thing for Paul to be in debt to high-ranking members of a New York City mafia family. Anderson talked to Leanne a little while longer and then thanked her for her time. He headed out to his car and drove back to Amityville. In the course of only a few hours, Anderson had been forced to take a completely different view on this case. He still considered Paul a suspect, but now Anderson had a totally new theory as to what could have happened. He thought maybe the mafia had put out a hit on Alex, so Paul's best friend, as a way to warn Paul. Pay us the money you owe us, or you'll be next. In February of 2001, so about a month after Alex's murder, Detective Anderson got word that Paul and Leanne had reconciled and repaired their marriage. But there was more to the story than that. Paul had moved with Leanne and their kid down to Florida, and members of Alex's family and a lot of other people in Amityville were up in arms about it. Many people in the community had never stopped believing that Paul killed Alex, and now they thought Paul had left the state to run away from the crime he had committed. The pressure on Anderson to arrest Paul continued to grow, and some people questioned whether Anderson was even doing his job. But Anderson understood their frustration. He also wanted to bring Alex's killer to justice. But he wasn't just going to cave in and arrest Paul because he actually didn't have any concrete evidence against Paul. Anderson's team had confirmed Paul's alibi for the night of the murder, and they'd combed over the crime scene at the gym multiple times, and nothing they found directly linked Paul to Alex's murder. On top of that, Anderson was following up on leads that connected Paul to the mafia. He was supposedly in debt to dangerous men, he had that public fight with a member of the Gambino family, and Alex's murder did seem to look like it could have been a mob-style hit. So Anderson remained focused and calm, and he kept pursuing all of the possible leads in the case. He also told his team not to be swayed by public opinion. Just because others had already made up their minds about what had happened did not mean they needed to do that too. But over the next month, Anderson hit one dead end after another. He couldn't discover any definitive links between Paul and the Gambino family or any other high-ranking members in the mafia. Then, in April, so 3 months after Alex's murder, Anderson found out that Leanne was pregnant. And this news sparked another round of anger from the Amityville community and threatened to make Anderson's job even harder than it already was. People were outraged that Paul was allowed to carry on with his life and watch his family grow after he had robbed his best friend Alex of a chance to start his own family. Anderson continued to sympathize with the people who were frustrated with him. He knew they just wanted answers. So Anderson kept working every angle of the case he could think of, but he felt like he was running out of time. He needed a break in the case to help appease his loudest critics and to at least give Alex's family some hope that justice would be served. On November 11, 2001, so almost 10 months after Alex's murder, a detective from the New York City Police Department sat across a table from a guy in custody and listened to him rambling about how he could help the police. The NYPD detective almost found the whole thing kind of amusing. It was pretty common for people in custody to try to cut a deal by giving up information on crimes that were even worse than the ones they'd committed. A lot of times, though, the so-called leads these people provided went absolutely nowhere. But occasionally, some leads would pan out. So the detective sat there with a slight smile on his face and just listened. But then the guy in custody said something that really caught the detective's attention. And so his smile disappeared, and he leaned forward and told the guy to slow down and repeat what he just said. The guy nodded and leaned in closer, almost like he and the detective were on the same team. Then he repeated what he had just said. He said he knew who had killed that gym owner in Amityville, and he knew why they killed him. Now remember, Amityville is a small town about 2 hours away from Manhattan, and so criminals trying to cut a deal with the NYPD did not usually reference small-town crimes like this one. So the detective sensed this could actually be legitimate. So he got all the details he could from this guy in custody about Alex Aguirre's murder. Then the detective walked out of the room, went to his desk, and made a phone call. A second later, an officer with the Suffolk County Police told Detective Anderson there was a call for him from an NYPD detective. The officer said that this detective was calling with information about the Alex Aguirre case, and it could potentially break the case wide open. Anderson walked to his desk, and as he did, he felt a rush of adrenaline. This was the first time in months that he actually might have a possible new lead. On the phone, the NYPD detective told Anderson about the conversation he'd just had with the guy in custody. Both detectives were well aware that desperate people under arrest were not usually the most reliable sources, because they basically will do anything to get out of custody, but the NYPD detective thought the information he'd gotten was actually worth passing on. Anderson listened to the detective and scribbled down the name of a man that he needed to track down. Anderson thanked the NYPD detective for his help, and then he quickly rounded up his team and told them they might finally have a major break in the Alex Aguirre case. The information Anderson got from the NYPD detective led him right to a man who was supposedly involved in Alex's murder. The man was clearly struggling with drug addiction. He seemed jittery and all over the place when he spoke, and he spun a wild story about how and why Alex had been murdered. At first, Anderson wasn't sure he could believe anything this man told him, but Anderson and his team dug deeper into the man's story, and several of the details checked out. And after that meeting, it would still take Detective Anderson several months to put everything together, but he finally had evidence connecting someone directly to Alex's murder. Based on interviews conducted throughout the investigation and evidence found at the scene, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on the night of January 17, 2001, when somebody murdered Alex outside of his gym. At about 7 p.m., a white minivan drove past the Dolphin Fitness Club. Inside the van were two people. There was the driver and also the killer. And the killer was scanning the area for the perfect spot to stake the place out. Both people inside the van wore zip-up hooded sweatshirts, and the killer rested a .38 caliber pistol on his knee. The killer pointed to an empty parking space on the street that had a clear view of the employee parking lot. So the driver drove around towards the back of the gym, pulled the van into that parking space, and then turned off the engine. Then the driver and the killer kept their eyes fixed on the employee parking lot and made small talk to pass the time. The killer figured it could be hours before they could make their move, but they were willing to wait as long as it took, because this area, this employee parking lot, offered the best place to shoot someone without being seen. The lot was dark, and only a few people ever parked there. The killer checked their gun to make sure it was loaded, then they, along with the driver, just kept on talking and watching the parking lot. But then, just 20 minutes later, the killer suddenly sat up in the passenger seat and leaned in closer to the window. The wait had not been long at all. Their target was already in the parking lot, walking towards his black Yukon SUV. The killer told the driver to start the van and to be ready to speed out of there. The killer clutched the pistol tight in one hand, then opened the door with the other, and walked into the parking lot. The killer saw Alex open up his car door and lean inside, and as he did, the dome light came on. Not wanting to be too close to the light, the killer shouted something at Alex just to get his attention and to kind of pull him away from his vehicle and the light. And it worked because Alex turned to see who was yelling at him, and he took a few steps away from his car towards the killer. And at that point, the killer just rushed out of the darkness and got within a couple of feet of Alex, who had no idea what was going on, and the killer raised his gun and fired before Alex could do anything. The first bullet hit Alex square in the chest. Then the killer squeezed off 3 more shots, one right after the other. Bullets struck Alex across his upper body, perforating his heart and both of his lungs. Then the killer fired off one more shot, which hit Alex in the neck. Alex fell to the ground, covered in blood. At this point, the killer turned and ran back to the white van. The killer never saw Alex pulling himself up and staggering back towards the gym. As soon as the killer was back inside the van, they slammed the door shut and yelled for the driver to go. So the driver whipped out of the parking space and sped down the street. A few minutes later, the driver heard ambulance and police sirens on the other side of the road, so they eased off the gas. They didn't want to draw attention to the van. When they were a few miles away from the gym, the killer spotted a creek just off the side of the road. So they rolled down their window and hurled the gun into the water. Then they told the driver to floor it, and the van sped down the road again. Not long after that, the driver pulled onto the highway, and the van headed south, far away from Amityville, New York. The following night, the killer and the driver sat in the killer's living room reading an online story about the murder. The shooting outside the gym had made the national news, but the killer and driver read the story more than once because they could not believe what they were seeing. Then the front door opened, and before the killer could even say anything, a woman barged in and shouted at him at the top of her lungs, "You stupid bastard, you killed the wrong guy!" It would turn out Leanne Riedel, Paul's wife, had set up the hit outside of the gym. But Alex was never the intended target. Leanne had wanted her husband, Paul, dead. And the killer, a man named Rocco Salerno, had been more than happy to oblige, because it turned out that Leanne and Rocco had been having an affair since Leanne had left New York and went to stay with her mother in Florida. Leanne and Rocco had fallen in love and wanted to start their lives together, but Paul was in the way. To make things worse, Paul had already filed with a court in New York to begin divorce proceedings. And if Paul and Leanne got divorced, well, New York law would require Leanne to come back to the state and live within 50 miles of Paul so he could see his son. But Leanne didn't want to leave Florida and Rocco, so she and Rocco hatched a plan to murder Paul. Rocco paid a guy he knew $3,000 to drive him to New York, scope out the gym with him, and serve as his getaway driver after the shooting took place. So, on the night of the murder, Rocco and this driver are sitting there and they see this huge guy walk into the parking lot, and he goes to his black Yukon, and Rocco thought this was his target, because Paul was also a big guy who happened to own the same make and model of black Yukon that his best friend Alex owned. So Rocco rushed out of the van and gunned down Alex in cold blood, not realizing he had shot the wrong person. When Leanne discovered what had happened, she came up with a way to try to fix things. She reconciled with Paul so he wouldn't divorce her and make her move back to New York. Then she convinced Paul to move to Florida because so many people in Amityville, including his friends, were treating him like a murderer. And then once they were back in Florida, Leanne just continued her affair with Rocco. And her plan was to divorce Paul after both of them had become Florida residents, because that way she would not be forced to leave the state. And all of this came to light after the guy in custody with the NYPD told police he had information about Alex's murder. It turned out the guy in custody actually happened to know the driver of the white minivan, and so this guy in custody had actually heard all the details of everything that had happened during the murder. So Detective Anderson tracked the driver down, and he discovered that the driver was struggling with a drug problem, and the driver said that's why he had accepted the $3,000 to drive Rocco to and from the gym in Amityville, and the driver quickly cut a plea deal, and he would give authorities everything they needed to bring Rocco in. But even with Rocco in custody, Leanne denied having anything to do with the murder. She said she had always loved Paul and that they had even had a second child together. Leanne also tried to act like she barely knew Rocco. But soon it became clear that the child that Leanne had recently given birth to was not her husband Paul's, it was Rocco's child. And at that point, all of Leanne's denials about her role in this murder quickly fell apart. The actual killer, Rocco Salerno, was convicted of conspiracy and first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As for Leanne, she was convicted of conspiracy and first-degree murder as well, and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. She continued to maintain her innocence and appealed her conviction, but the appeal was denied. Alex's best friend Paul might have had some demons, but he had nothing to do with his friend's murder. Paul was granted custody of his and Leanne's child, and with his child, he returned to Amityville. He ended up renaming the gym Big Al's Family Fitness in honor of his fallen friend, and Paul has said that he strives to live his life and run his business with the type of integrity and kindness that would make Alex proud.
By the lights drift through the motionless air, tracing circles on walls that no longer care. In a room built from memories I never claimed, silent stories whisper my name. Every we kept the sunset in our pockets, golden streaks beneath our skin, running fast through summer doorways, chasing days we couldn't pin. Our laughter caught in shining echoes, skipping like stones across the breeze. We didn't know what love could feel like, but it found us with such ease. And every heartbeat drummed in time with wild horizons in our eyes. Oh, we were burning bright as the sky, learning how to paint fire on.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Those are